Chapter 6, Learning. This is Part 4, Operant Conditioning. We're going to talk about the processes of operant conditioning, and this is Professor Munk. So keeping in mind that we just talked about classical conditioning, and classical conditioning requires a reflex or unlearned behavior to be involved. Right? So that can explain quite a bit of behavior, and I gave you some examples of clinical applications. But that doesn't explain most behavior because most of our behaviors learn not through the pairing of stimuli and not through reflexes, but through behavior that's not reflexive. And so we use the term operant conditioning. Behavioral psychologists coined this term. B.F. Skinner coined this term to describe a type of learning in which behavior is determined by consequences. So if you're wondering where that term operant came from, it's because the individual operates on the environment before consequences can occur. So operant conditioning requires a response to occur. Classical conditioning, no, it didn't require a response. It just required the eliciting of a reflex. Operant conditioning involves voluntary actions. All right, classical conditioning involves reflexive responses. So it may perhaps as we were going through the section on classical conditioning, you were thinking, well, this explains some of my behavior, but most of what I do, I would say, doesn't involve a reflex. So how does it explain that? Well, actually, it doesn't, and so that's why we need operant conditioning to help explain other kinds of behavior. So here are the basic processes of operant conditioning. And I'm sure you've heard these terms before, and oftentimes they're not used correctly, but they've made it into the kind of common everyday sort of vernacular for most people. Reinforcement process, by which an event or reward follows a response and increases the likelihood of that response. So one of the things I want to really emphasize here is that reinforcement, or something, when we say that something is reinforcing, we usually are thinking about something that is likable, right? It's desirable, pleasant, um, something that we would all agree would be um, a consequence that we would like to have. But that's actually not how reinforcement is technically defined. It's defined by its effect on the behavior that preceded that. And so um, let me give you an example. So in my career, I've spent many years working with kids in schools who were getting into mischief and not learning and just not being as successful as they should have been able to. And what you learn very quickly is that a lot of the behavior that goes on, and sometimes teachers will even say this, is attention getting behavior. So a student might do something to get into trouble in class, and they end up being scolded by the teacher, and perhaps while most students would be embarrassed or um, really afraid, for some reason this particular child is not. So we could say that in fact that the teacher's attention, the negative attention being given by the teacher, is actually reinforcing the behavior that's going on. So, right, so that's an example of why you can't define reinforcement as just something that we think is pleasant. It's defined by its effect on the behavior that preceded it. Thorndike was the first to study, came up with the law of effect. I think you probably have maybe in high school in your psychology class. This is too simplistic, but it was a good start. Responses followed by satisfaction occur again. Those not followed by satisfaction will become less likely. The problem, as I just mentioned before with reinforcement, is that sometimes we don't agree on what's satisfying and what's satisfying. So here's the kitty in the box, and here's how it works. Right? So you got your kitty, you got your food, you got your trap door. So how's this kitty going to get through here? Well, just let the cat move around until it was exploring the environment and it pulled on this lever and the door opened, right? So that was the very first trial. So here's how long it took in seconds for the cat to wander around and explore and eventually pull down on that lever. But the next time, here's how much it was cut. And you could see that eventually, the minute they would put the cat back into the box, the cat immediately went over and pulled the lever. So they learned very quickly that by pulling the lever, it was going to open the door and you're going to get access to the food. Here's an operant chamber. So in the late 40s and in the 50s and into the 60s, when behavioral psychology was growing and becoming more popular, and B.F. Skinner was doing a lot of research and writing. He wasn't the only one, but he was the most prominent behavioral psychologist. There was a lot of work that was done with rats and pigeons. Maybe you've heard about some of those teaching pigeons to try to navigate missiles and such, and pigeons to play ping pong, and they taught rats to do all sorts of things. So here's a typical operant chamber. You've got lights, you've got a water dispenser, you know, food dispenser over here. And so they used this device to study the different ways in which reinforcement affected behavior. And so you can see right here, you've got, it could be when the light goes on, the food is available. And so this is how they studied schedules of reinforcement. So most of this operant research started with rats and with pigeons, but then a good deal has been done in applied settings with humans also. So I want to point out something in that, and that's the origins of the term timeout. I always think this is interesting because most students know what timeout means because they hope perhaps it was not you who experienced it, but in school or sometime someone had to have a timeout, right? And so usually it's that they did something they weren't supposed to do and they needed to go sit. They need to go sit on the side. And if you ask a lot of teachers, certainly parents, but teachers who probably should know a bit more about it, what does timeout mean? Usually they don't really understand or aren't familiar with kind of where it came from. Well, it actually came from an operant chamber, just like this one. It was an experiment in which um, I think it actually was Skinner, but what they're experimenting with is after a certain response, if the lights go out and there's no longer access to reinforcement. So in other words, you're pressing the bar, you're pressing the bar, you're pressing the bar, but then they decide that when the rat presses a particular number of times or does something else inside the chamber, the lights go out and they can no longer press for food. That's called timeout from reinforcement. And so what they were studying was, does taking away the opportunity to press for food, does that serve as a punisher, and will the rat not engage in the behavior again that caused the light to go out? And in fact, it did work that way. So that's where that's the origins of the term timeout from reinforcement. That's certainly not so timeout from reinforcement used in classrooms. What it should mean is you have to go sit here and you're not going to be able to interact with your friends and do other things and earn reinforcement and attention from the teacher, right? The light went out. And now whatever you did to earn the opportunity to go be in timeout, if this works, then you're not going to do that again because you don't want to be in timeout. So a little story about the origins of timeout. All right, here's a really important slide. I'm going to have to hurry because this is going to be a longer video, but this is really super important. And if you keep looking at this, eventually you'll be able to, I think it'll help you figure out the difference between positive and negative reinforcement, which is always the most difficult thing. All right, so let's start with the basics. Reinforcement always means behavior goes up, increases. Punishment always decreases behavior. Behavior goes down. Right? Now here's how it works. In positive reinforcement, you add something. There's a behavior, and then it causes something to be added that wasn't there before, and it makes it more likely that the behavior will occur in the future. So in this case, the lever is pressed, food's given. In negative reinforcement, in this particular example, behavior increases because in behaving, the behavior causes something to stop that was unpleasant, right? So in this case, this is an example, is that if the rat was in the cage and there was a low voltage shock and the rat had to press the bar to turn off the shock, it would increase bar pressing, okay? Think of this is a condition in which you're going to engage in more of a behavior to get out from under that condition. I'm going to give you a human example here in a minute. So punishment, the lever's pressed, the shock's given, decreases behavior. In positive punishment, something's added and that decreases behavior. In negative punishment, something's taken away. So you can think about it. Sometime in your lives, you probably have had some punishment, and usually it's this kind. Something privileges are taken away, or something that you like is taken. Positive and negative reinforcement, punishment. Um, so behavior can be increased, kind of reiterating what was just on that chart. In negative reinforcement, behavior can be increased through reward, and positive reinforcement rather, or through the removal of aversive stimuli. Right? And I'm going to show you an example. It's either on this slide or it might be at the beginning of the next one. So we're going to talk about a young driver who gets into trouble in the next set of slides.